Dear Paradigma listeners, welcome to the podcast. This is Irama Narman, and today we have a very special guest, Professor Lene Hansen from the University of Copenhagen. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for sparing us some time in your very busy schedule.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Well, Professor Hansen doesn't need further introductions, but today we will talk about her work on security. For instance, her book, Security as Practice, or her recent work on images, visibilities, and emotions. If that's okay with you, I want to ask and shoot the first question.
Excellent. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Well, your recent work, very interesting. It introduces us Gothic visibilities and the uncanny as analytical lenses. So the question is, what motivated this conceptual turn, and how do such aesthetics help us understand the contemporary conflicts and visual narratives in today's world?
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you asking about that recent article. The first thing I want to say is that there is a particular history to it because it started out as a paper that my two now co-authors, but then students, Carl Winfeld and Marius Wiethammer, that they wrote in a class that I taught in the spring of 2021 on images and world politics. And as part of the assignment, the students had to they first had to write an assignment on dealing with a particular discrete iconic image. So one particular image that, sort of stood out. And that was a photograph from the war in Aleppo, Dagnesh, a little boy who was sitting in the back of an ambulance. And then for the second assignment, the students had to then collect independently a larger number of images and create, a question around that. And Fredrik and Marius came to me with the idea that we think that there is a Gothic visibility involved. First with the iconic photo of Dagnesh, and then later on with the larger visualization of the war in Aleppo. And I have to confess, I mean, now it's an article in Review of International Studies that I was a bit skeptical at first. So I said, I need more convincing than that this one particular image, which, spoke that there was a sort of an intervisuality. So that is that you could see that particular icon related to, other images that we know of, something that people who look almost like ghosts. Right? And he looked sort of shell-shocked, like he was in a different world. And then they were sort of pointing out how the coverage in the international news media also very much involved discourse, saying like he's like a ghost, this is a sort of eerie, atmosphere to this image. And then Fredrik and Marius, thankfully, was sort of like rose to the challenge, and they collected a data set of 500 news stories and the images that went with them, and then worked, say like there's a larger discourse, not just around this image, that invokes kind of Gothic tropes and those sort of, if you're speaking very technically in terms of discourse, those kind of signifiers, like words that would point us in that direction. And similarly, when you're looking to this larger data set, there's a recurring motif of ruins, for example. So I thought that this was a fantastic paper, and then we agreed that we would write this paper together, and start from this paper and then turn it into an article. And so this is also to say that to look for Gothic visibilities and the uncanny, it was really an idea that Fredrik and Marius first suggested to me, and I'm very happy that they did. I think sort of the point of the art, like the key point of making that turn is first of all, sort of the argument that it was something that was a part of the Western news coverage that they collected, both in terms of the discourse, but also in terms of the intervisuality. So in that sense, to make this conceptual turn, you could say actually at first that there's almost kind of like an empirical referent. Right? If there is a Gothic, discourse, a Gothic visuality, then that can, communicate to those who read and see these images, then we need as researchers to also, to capture that and unpack that and, sort of theorize around, conceptualize around what it is that this does. I think it was important then also, when we were working, on the articles in the sort of 6 months after it was first presented, to work more specifically on the context of Gothic potentialities. Uh, and the concept of potentiality is that we're able to identify by doing, a textual discourse analysis, by doing an analysis of the intervisualities and the kind of visual discourse that these images can be said to be a part of, that it, potentially invokes the Gothic. But whether that would resonate, with those who actually read and see it, we can't say for sure. Right. So that also, so the potentiality says that there's something that yeah, it is a possibility, but whether it actually communicates that way, particularly to everybody, is something that we cannot say for sure. And the answer is less to go out and say, oh, we could do a survey design, and it's a more theoretical argument that is around the way in which that both specific images and specific text are always part of our larger intertextuality and intervisuality. And we can make arguments about, how that might potentially invoke a particular visual textual discourse. But we also need to, we need to allow for the possibility that there is agency in the way in which that intervisuality and that intertextuality, is taken on board. So this is also, we're as a coming out of a kind of post-structuralist performative tradition myself, is I always get a bit queasy when I hear, it's like, this is how this image is going to make people feel. Like you might have this already when somebody is telling you how you're going to feel, that you automatically resist if you're kind of, subversive personality. But it also means that this is a way to engage with here Gothic, but also more generally, for example, with emotional potentiality, where it is a potentiality, where you as a researcher don't have to make the claim about how everybody, will feel and so on. So it also frees something up in terms of not kind of trying to find out what are the kind of objective conditions about something in an image or in a text that will have a particular effect. So, so that was sort of kind of the conceptual, theoretical work that I also thought was an important part of unpacking this. I think also the sort of working with the Gothic and saying that, if one is coming out of the tradition that I am in, then you're saying that, okay, there's a politics of representation. So what is it that's being depicted if we're dealing with images? Here, you have a small boy, he's hurt, sort of, that's being connected in discourse to being a signifier of, war in Aleppo and more broadly Syria and even more broadly to, what happens to children in the midst of war. Then there is a second part of sort of discourse analysis. And if you go back to Security as Practice, which is a book that I wrote almost 20 years ago, there's a kind of what the significance of the epistemic. So, drawing broadly on a more sort of Foucauldian tradition, which is to say that a politics of representation also always involves making claims, around the authority around which we can say that something is represented. That became an ugly sentence, but the point is that knowledge and knowledge production in this larger Foucauldian understanding is also always at stake. Right. So you would have, if we're dealing with photojournalism, I mean, there's a traditional kind of referring to the authority that goes with that something was actually in front of the camera when something happened. So there's a documentary authority that is situated, within that genre or within that epistemic, regime of which photojournalism is a part. So this means also, for example, that photojournalism is vulnerable to criticism that things were moved around or both before the image was taken but also now with Photoshop and like digital all the kinds of things you can do, that something has been altered subsequently. So that's the sort of that was just an example, but it means that there's always these sort of claims to knowledge and particular representations and practices that are relating to a knowledge form. Also, think about how, politicians, for example, can invoke their own personal experiences when they're justifying particular, policies. And we saw that, and a good example of that was in the response to the circulation of the iconic photo of Alan Kurdi, where we saw, politicians, but also others talking about their experience as a partner, or sorry, as a parent, and as a father, and how that also meant that they could relate emotionally to that, to that image. So that's also in that broader, understanding of knowledge, the personal experiential, and in that sense also constituting, knowledge and feeling on like physical, physical reaction to something is also to invoke an epistemic, an epistemic regime or an epistemic discourse in this, right? So this was the second one. The third one, and that's what I think like the Gothic comes in, and it's related to both of those, but it does something a little bit different because it says that it can be a particular, I wouldn't say ambience because that's wrong. That's almost like it's a Gothic is an ambience. But there's something about a more specific that a form of genre or representation that is a potentiality. So here in that article, it's the Gothic, but in another example is surrealism, which I worked on in a book that's forthcoming, where there's a chapter on an iconic photo that some might know if they're kind of also more into to sort of the art scene with Lee Miller in Hitler's bathtub, and there was a movie Lee by Kate Winslet that came out last year, and Lee Miller is also mentioned very briefly in Civil War. So that's sort of, and she was mobilizing, throughout her career, a surrealist visual language, both as an artist but also as a photojournalist. So this means also that there's something, which adds some specificity to the way in which that, let's say, things in an image are shown and represented, and the kind of knowledge form, because it tells us something different. It gives us an additional layer, right? To those sort of that kind of politics of representation, which is both what we see, how they're referring to something, the knowledge, and then the kind of more specificity of the of that particular mode of representing. So I thought that that was very interesting as well. Then the final thing that I want to say about it is that the Gothic is also, I think, interesting for the way in which that it draws our attention to the fact that visibility and invisibility are not a dichotomy. Right. So you can also use it to kind of deconstruct that sort of either you see something or you don't. Okay? And the way in which and the uncanny is part of that. Kind of, the sort of loosely drawing on Christopher in that article also, but the fact that you have a sense that something is lurking. Like, something is lurking in the ruins. Something is either outside of the frame and might potentially come in, but it might also be kind of in the frame, but you can't actually see it. So you could also say, if you want to do more traditional semiotic concepts from Roland Barthes, that there is always a connotation and a connotative and a denotative message in a photograph. So the denotation is what you're actually seeing, can sort of objectively describe, and the connotations is what you bring to the interpretation of that in an image. And in that sense, what the Gothic does, because there is that sort of uncanny that something is both present and absent. I think it provides a really helpful way to deconstruct, the juxtaposition between something being visible or invisible.
Yes, at that point, thank you so much, Professor, because we were just on the point of Alan Kurdi and the article related to your work on that specific imagery. We were really curious to hear your thoughts on the concept of abjection, perhaps, because also we are doing another work, perhaps with another colleague, on the concept of abjection and how it is utilized by far-right parties per se. But on our topic, more or less, and the politics of violent imagery, perhaps with regarding your article, how do you see the relationship between emotion, abjection, and political meaning in images during crises, or that circulate during crises, perhaps?
Mm. I would say that I wouldn't say that I'm a sort of theoretical expert on the concept of objection. We work it in the Gothic article, and I said that Frederick and Marius took the lead on that. And I think that that's sort of so to speak that it has at least in certain work, sort of psychoanalytical, history, and also with Christopher as well, that we're drawing on that the abject is something that you cannot cast off. So the example of of the child trying to separate from the mother but not being able to. Other example is how the corpse is dead, but it's also kind of it has a relationship to the living, like, that you cannot completely cast that off. Um, and so I think that it's a helpful I think it's a helpful way to think about also again that the difficulty of making separations. I mean that's a very broad claim, but I think that if you take the iconic photo of Alan Kurdi, that's obviously like, we know that that's a dead boy, but there is also almost a sort of inability to separate that photo of death, both from, our imagination or looking at photos that circulated at the time of Alan Kurdi alive. But also sort of part of it, like the difficulty of then also of that corpse, if you're doing the Christopher, sort of the dead Alan Kurdi, to not also always be alive. Right? And so in that sense, of course, we know that intellectually, but the power of the photograph and its ability to also, to continue to circulate, thing is because there is that kind of relationship, that makes it something that we cannot fully, just leave aside. I think that that's sort of to try to bring, kind of the basics of that concept into sort of an understanding of why it is also that part of the reasons why an image like that can get, sort of both the emotional responses, but also the kind of have the political impact that it did. Um, so I think that's kind of I think that points to sort of a helpful dynamic. Then I think more broadly, sometimes also we're looking to sort of international relations literature and so on. The abject is sometimes used, I think, in a slightly maybe related but slightly different way, where it's about those who are abject. Right. So then it becomes more connected with a subject that are those who are, the most victimized. Right. And then it becomes something that's related to how do we understand, agency, and how do we understand relations between those who are abject and those like if people are really like those the subjects that are really abjects are rarely able to, theorize and conceptualize about themselves. Right? Because that's kind of that's sort of almost a kind of ontologically packed into that concept. So that sort of takes us in, I think, to also very important debates about how do we as scholars and how do we as professions and so on, how do we both allow for the possibility that people don't, like others do not have the agency that we will have when we're writing. This is back to Spivak and can the subaltern speak, and so it's both about that, but it's also about given that as critical scholars that we don't want to objectify we don't want to objectify the abject. So it's both and also feminist debates, it's both about recognizing structural inequalities, and that the ability of subjects to constitute themselves politically are not equal, at the same time as you are not trying to, ventriculate their experiences, or constituting them as a they, because I think that that's also, one of the difficulties when you're dealing with collective concepts, which we have to, because otherwise we can't, theorize. Like we can't, everything can't be like cut into little bits and pieces. So we need to have collective concepts. We can't get away with those. But they also come with particular, structures and hierarchies and differences cut into them that always position us who, write and speak in relation to that. That became a very, maybe sort of a very abstract, theoretical argument. But I think that that's also what what the concept of the abject, I think the kind of, analytical terrain that it is also a part of. You're welcome to ask me something more specific. That became very abstract.
Thank you so much for the answers. Well, both Arman and I, we love the abstract, so
So
I think
that
we are having so much fun right now. And we are really intellectually stimulated right now. Thank you so much for these answers. Well, now we are surrounded by visuals, and we wanted to ask you this because we are also students that are living in the age of AI.
yeah.
So we have these platforms that are deeply affecting the circulation of images. So the question is, now images are shaped by algorithms, synthetic visuals, deepfakes, AI. So do we need new theoretical tools to study these images, or existing concepts or methodologies can help us to capture this new technological environment?
Thank you. That's a great, and it is also it's also a really difficult question. Um, I think first I want to actually to sort of like as a way to sort of move into that to say that history obviously matters, and one of the things that I've sort of thought about in the last couple of years as well is also, let's say, what did kind of how the time that we live through when we're young, and of course, I'm not setting any like what that age is because you can be young for a really long time, right? And some people become old really, very early. But there's something about I think about what are the formative that there's something formative years for you and how you can remember those, when you become older. And I think in that what I'm saying is that I think that those sort of transformations in technology that one is subjected to or part of that, enthusiastic about, as you go through your life. I think that they're quite formative. Uh, so when I wrote my PhD in the mid 1990s, there was one email account in my whole department. Like there was no World Wide Web that you could go into. The way in which you would search for literature, where you went to a library, which was not like something online, but an actual physical building. Like, so this meant also, of course, in terms of the questions about images, that was something that was produced by professionals. And at least if you're looking at what were in newspapers and what was on television, there were no social media the way we know it now. So I think that for those who've done of my generation, we're coming out of a very different I would call it political visual temporality, right? Because this is also about what are your expectations about who can produce something that is politically relevant, who responds to it, what's the circulation speed, how much time do you have to engage with what's coming up. So people like James Tadarian, drawing on Virilio, has written about this for many years about, speed and acceleration. Um, and I think that's an important, I would say, sort of larger, political, but also I think theoretical backdrop to more specific questions, which are about, does AI change the way that we conceptualize the image, or that we think about, the possibility of having truth in society. Um, and I think that so this is both that I think the question that you're asking might also be answered a little bit differently depending on the age of that person. Because it's not just, I mean, of course you can do historical research, you don't have to have been part of it, but I think there's something about the way in which that visual IR, like the visual that circulates, we're all a part of it. Right. Nobody is an external and can just say like, oh, this is something I study. It is something that we're all participants in, And if we're choosing not to be participants, we're still participants because you can't opt out you know, and separate yourself out fundamentally from the societal conditions of which this, like this is a part. So this was the sort of to say that I think that because we're all part of those transformations, I think we also have all particular personal experiences and histories that go into how we would answer that question. Right? So this is to sort of be built up to what I'm going to say now, because this was like the old person building up. Because I'd say that I'm not saying that we don't need to have new concepts, and I'm not saying that there aren't things that specifically relate to what is happening, has happened in the last 10 years and what might happen the next 10 years that are not in need of particular concepts and theorization. So the visual that we started out with, conceptualizations of the iconic image, the concept of the instant icon or the hyper icon, where something becomes an iconic image almost as like instantaneously, as was the case with the photographs of Alan Kurdi. That is something that is particular to the capacity of social media to circulate, images at a rapid pace to, huge numbers of people who then also remediate, that image and circulate that and so on. So we need specific, concepts of that sort. But I think there is also something that is of the more general theoretical level where we also, have concepts that can help us. And I think it's a sort of the question of the concept of like epistemic regimes or, the significance that particular epistemic forms have. And again, sort of going back to Foucault, that helps us to understand these sort of concerns and debates over whether we're actually losing a concept of truth, and what that does to society. So, and how historically certain technologies have also created, discussions about whether, whether we're seeing something where it becomes more difficult for those who are, audiences or consumers, more critically, resist potential flows of images. So if you're going to, late 60s and sort of Guy Debord and Society of the Spectacle, and we'd see like advertisement and the kind of capitalist system and the way in which we would be saturated, both of course with the commercial, but also the way that news was produced. So in a way that actually was counter to counter to the actual real engagement of people. So I'm not saying that there are all kinds of problems with that argument, and I'm also not saying that we're now in a society of spectacle. But it gives us something to think with. It gives us something that the relationship between image producers and those who are consumers of those is something that has also been thought about critically before, right? And of course, then also so I think the point is not to say like now we're really in society of the spectacle and so on, because something obviously has also changed with the possibility of people to communicate. It's not the classical media models of, mass media and the entertainment industry. And then you have, sort of citizens looking, up at the screen. But I think it gives us something to say some of those concerns have also been discussed before, and we can relate, to those. Skepticism about photography has been around since photography started. And, some of the most famous first images of wars, Fenton from the first like Crimea War, and whether he had actually moved things around to have an aesthetically pleasing image. So that also that has also been a part of it, and I think that gives us some both historical contextualization, but I think it also gives us a way to sort of look at and sort of think what are the epistemic expectations that people have towards images at a particular moment in time, right? So if you go first, but go back to some of the, like the first, when cameras went into conflicts and war zones, because of the exposure time and like the equipments and so on, these would be very static images. Right. So it would be posed and before or after battle, or there would be objects and so on. So in that sense, we would say, in the contemporary sensibilities, oh, they don't show like actual fighting, right? Because you wouldn't be able to. but audiences at the time would not have an expectation that that would be what you saw. Right? So the relationship between the technology, those who produce it, and the expectations of what it means to have like an image of war, are also themselves, that they are also themselves changing. Um, and I think that also that sort of if we're thinking about it in that sort of with these sort of meta concepts, maybe we would also think about what happens in the age of AI and platform logics is that we're at a stage where these things are being radically negotiated. Right. So what constitutes a real image is something that we could say sort of is being problematized, right? Of course, it's being problematized whether photojournalism will, be so tainted by, cases of, alterations to photos that we, quote unquote, can no longer trust the authenticity and the true status, of the photojournalistic image. Okay. That's something, I mean, that's something that's ongoing. And it also, these things are not static. So it also depends on, the ability of kind of classical photojournalism to maintain its epistemic authority as being a particular kind of image producers. Right? I'm a little, perhaps in some ways, I mean, I think that we say sort of maybe not so skeptical as some are that deep fake and synthetic visuals and so on will undermine those claims completely. And I think that when I'm looking to the coverage of the war in Ukraine, you could see that a lot of like the really very prominent photojournalists have gone there, and their work is being published. Lindsay Addario, Tyler Hicks, Ron Haviv, and so on. And I think precisely because there is all of these questions asked to the medium of photojournalism, the authority of those individuals who have that epistemic capacity that they status that they have mean that they become a guarantee that the photographs are actually authentic. And sort of 20 years ago, the Iraq War, for example, there was also this sort of concern that traditional photojournalism would disappear because it was so cheap and easy to produce images. And I think in some ways, I see, sort of that there actually has been, a reinvestment of the authority in the traditional photojournalist who never disappeared, of course, but that there's almost I wouldn't say that there's a kind of dialectic, but but that the questions that are being raised about the epistemic authority because of technology and so on actually also creates a continued need or a further need for having somebody who will guarantee that authority. So I think that there are also things that are working in that direction. I would say also, and it's not because it's we're getting towards Christmas, and it's nice to have more optimistic messages than that than that things are going like there are lots of things that aren't optimistic stuff in the world, but if you're looking to the possibilities of just something as simple as Google Images. And so it also, enables alterations, at least to known images, to be identified more quickly. Right? So there's also something about the possibility of like the network digitized and so on that makes it more difficult to present something as inaccurate. Uh, so I think that we're dealing in an age where we're seeing we're seeing pulls and tensions and directions that are running in various directions, and also going to say that where there's agency. Of course, there like these enormous tech companies and of course there are technologies and there are lots of other things, but there's also agency that is unfolding in terms of how media professionals, for example, politicians, and also we both as scholars and citizens, are engaging into this.
Regarding the time of yours, Professor, so maybe we can move on to maybe final question. question as a maybe like returning to an image or a concept as a theme. We wonder, is there particularly an image or a concept, either in your recent research or your further research that you're planning to do, or in current world politics, maybe, that you find yourself returning to oftentimes because it captures maybe a broader political moment or effective condition or something emotionally relevant to it? Is there something
Mhm.
particular to that?
Oh, that's a really excellent question. I was sort of thinking, I mean, concept, and somehow I would say, security, because I've also worked on the concept of security for many years, and there's so much rich also theoretical literature and so on. I could also say discourse because that's also kind of. Um, I think if I had to pick one, I think it would be performativity. Because I think performativity sits at the theoretical center of both that I sort of thought about discourses and the kind of textual politics of representation, but also around images. So it goes back to one of the first things we're talking about with Gothic potentialities and the potentiality, and also that there is always some work like that goes into representing wars, for example, conflicts, but also resolutions, good things that happen, and the way that these become connected to particular policies. So I mean that was the whole kind of thing, sort of politics of representation, going back to Michael Shapiro, his book Politics of Representation in the late 1980s. That's the performativity. There's always a doing when something is being described in a particular way. And there is always a performativity in the way that one particular image or set of images relate, to other images and to text, and therefore also to the way in which that they can become part of kind of say part of both the political, that's part of the political, but also how they become linked to more specific policies. Uh, and I think also the concept of performativity, of course, also, sort of owing to Judith Butler, is that identity is always practiced. Like there's not a fixed identity. And I think that that's also the whole point. Like, so it's not, Denmark does not have an identity. Right? Denmark is being constituted as a subject that does or must do certain things. For example, in terms of immigration. So this means also that performativity, draws our attention to the way in which that political arguments are being made, in reference to and on behalf of an identity, which I think is super important when we're dealing with international politics and when we're dealing with the way in which that governments and political leaders and so on are mobilizing that. Right? Or the performativity that would go into how tech giants are presenting themselves as bringing, transparency or possibilities and so on to the world. I mean, that's also performativity of themselves as a particular kind of actors and subjects in world politics. So I think I would have to say performativity because I think that's I think that sits at the center. In terms of the image, I I have a list of images, sort of there's a list of images in the book that I'm finishing, that I've been working on for a number of years on images and international relations. And the more I say it, the more performatively real it becomes, right? So, so I'm saying that I'm finishing it. I am finishing it. So the format of that book is that each chapter opens with an image. And that image is both it is something that speaks to what the theme of that chapter is. So I would sort of say that if I'm looking to those are the 10 chapters, that the 10 images that are opening those chapters will be at least some that are on that list. I'm not going to tell you all of what they are. That would take too long. Um, but I think if I could point to two images that I think are important of the many. I think that the iconic photo of the COVID-19 virus I think is important. The one that was produced by the Center for Disease Control in the U.S. and was sort of presented out and which quickly became used across news media and picked up and of course remediated in all kinds of ways, also as sort of public service announcements and directions and so on in the kind of material that authorities would be using. And I think that that's important both because it's a theoretically, I think, powerful image to draw our attention to the epistemic kind of the epistemic questions that are involved in some of those images, because I think it's for most people that became an image of the virus. Like that was the way the virus looked. Uh, and it's not like it's a composite image that's created by the graphic artist at the Center of Disease Control. So it's built on complicated technology that would give, I think, set up between 200 and 400 of the images of a little fragment of the COVID virus. So I think it's only the red parts that are actually referring to the COVID virus. The other parts of it is something that was created out of visual data banks that they had. And the viruses don't have colors. Like, so the colors that they chose were also chosen to give it the sort of striking, be aware, colors. And that's sort of, that's also, they've given interviews about it where they talk about it as an illustration. Like it's not, it isn't, but I think like that quickly became something that you would imagine that this is actually the virus, right? So they're also sort of trying to be, people would be afraid to touch things, that there would be the virus. And of course, all of these remediations where the virus became, sort of a creature, right? So the virus gets to have, an embodiment and a life. So I think that's it. I think it's a great illustration of some of the things about the politics and the significance of the epistemic. You can something can get the status of being real even if it's not. Right. But I think, and this is not a criticism. I think that this is just to sort of that in a sense you could also look at the COVID-19 virus as a data visualization. That this is data about what these kinds of viruses normally look like, and then they become condensed and they form this one picture that then sort of takes off and gets the status that it comes to have. Um, but I think also it's politically important. I think that if you think about what COVID-19 pandemic, the closure of the world, and from an international relations perspective as well. I mean, if you had said that this would be a possible scenario, that borders could close, that you would see, domestic sovereignty rise to something that's almost sort of, Hobbesian, kind of like the sovereign, really made sovereign decisions about who can come in and out and so on. So and all of the tragic losses of life. And now it's almost as if that's in a complete, like that was in a different galaxy. In so many, at least the spaces that I move in, there's very little research being published on COVID-19. I think it's a sort of, like this is something that was in the past. And I think that there's an ethical aspect to, to drawing attention to the ramification that COVID had. For a lot of people throughout the world. So in that sense, it's also an image that's an ethical image for me. Um, the other image that I want to close with is linked to migration. We talked about the Kurdi image. One of the chapters in the book is on sort of going into more depth with a visualization of migration, and for that a sort of like a visual genealogy of modern migration, which is both the migrant refugee, and I'm looking at five images to sort of speak to that history, and one of them is by a Danish American documentary photographer by the name of Jacob Riis, who created, now kind of path-breaking documentary photographs from New York in the late 1980s and 1990s to draw attention to the conditions that, immigrants that had come from mostly from Europe that they were living in on the Lower East Side, and it was collected in a book called How the Other Half Lives, and that was sort of influential in terms of drawing attention to the conditions and so on. There's a lot to sort of say about that, which I bring out in the book, and those photographs are really very striking. And there's an amazing archive. I mean, the archive of his work is at the website of the City Museum of New York, or Museum of the City of New York. I can remember one of the two, but they have they have sort of 1,400 images on view there, and I've gone through all of them, and then towards the end of it, after looking at all of these kind of photos that really bring out the terrible conditions that people are living in. Then there's a photograph of this little cat that is sitting by itself on a doorstep. And I think that that was all sort of, I was just like, oh my God, that's Jakob Ries's cat video. So you're gonna, and considering at the time, you like to take a photograph was a much different kind of investment than you do today, because you only had like the equipment, particular frame you had to develop, and kind of. So this isn't like, like this is a very different. Like think about how few photographs he actually produced, and all of this, sadness and then like we also need to have hope. We also need to have something, there's something emotionally that also kind of, I'm imagining, speaking over Jakob Ries here, that sort of like, oh man, that cat is just really lovely. I've spent the last, 15 years looking at, photographs and from war zones and other images. And, when you're working on security politics, that's largely what you do. So I think the cat is not in, it's not going to be in the book, but maybe the cat will be maybe the cat will be in the conclusion. But I think that's also an image that sort of speaks to me in as a yeah, to the significance of also, not being too, let me say, this isn't about how they should make us feel when we work on things. I think the message is rather that this is something that Jakob Ries also thought that it was important to take a photograph of, and that it also allows us to look at how to get an understanding at those people you're asking to, the abject before, right? That even in the terrible conditions of the Lower East Side, people would also, care for a kitten. Uh, and there would be, there would be care enacted, and an agency around making that choice to enact it, even in a condition as such that people were living in there.
Maybe the cat needs a whole new book, right? I'm really glad that this podcast, this episode did not go by without mentioning cats. Well, and thank you so much, Professor Hansen. This brings us to the end of today's conversation. Professor Hansen's insights reminds us why visuality continues to shape and reshape how we understand conflicts, emotions, identities, and the politics of representation, and what kind of tools, which tools we have to use images or to understand visuals today. We are looking forward to reading your upcoming book. I'm so excited now that you mentioned it. We would like to extend a heartfelt thank you for sharing your time and your thinking with us. And to our listeners, thank you for joining us. And looking forward to welcome you to the next episode. Until then, please take notes on this episode. Thank you so much for having us, and thank you for so much for coming.
Thank you so much for having me.